Um, Good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. I want to firstly acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I want to place on record in the recording my admiration and gratitude to Anik for this really inspired and very successful initiative. He's done a wonderful job. I think everyone will agree. And then I want to say how delighted I am. I haven't had the opportunity to study it, but I looked at some of the names of people who are there, and so many of you are dear friends. And I want to say good evening or whatever it is to you. And it's very nice of you to participate, and I wish you well. Okay, what I'm going to do tonight is something that I don't normally do, which is to talk about models and frameworks. But I wanted to do this because the theme that Anik has put into this of the global South and global North and the framing of language policy writing and implementation experiences calls for some effort to look at frameworks. So inspired by that suggestion from Anik, this is what I have put together. But before I do that, and I really hope Federico is on, he was supposed to be, we should acknowledge that today, the 15th of December, is in fact the time when there was a birthday party for the 19-year-old Ludwig Zamenhof, in 1887, when he presented to his friends this book, which was the first version of what eventually became Esperanto with the publication of Unua Libro. And this is a very interesting model of language policy and planning. Of course, it's not much discussed by language policy and planners for reasons that are curious, but I will I won't talk about that today, but it's a coincidence that this is occurring exactly on this evening. Now, I'm going to be talking about two concepts that are not very commonly used in language policy and planning. The first one is the language problem, which was an original concept very popular in the theories of language policy and planning of the pioneers of the field in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then became heavily criticized and repudiated and abandoned. And I'm going to say why I think it's a mistake for us to abandon that idea of language problems, even though I think there are enormous question marks over the concept, but I'll discuss that later. And the other one is the idea that you can see in the orange, which I hope is clear to you, of a language policy container, LP, I mean language policy. I'm going to use the word container quite a bit because if we're trying to combine the global South and the global North in a single conversation, and we're talking at a time of transnational realities with globalization and the weakening of the national state, then we have to ask the question, what is the container, sorry, people need to be admitted and they keep coming to me. What is the container that is the structuring the kind of language policy and planning process that occurs? So these are concepts that I'll define as I go through and talk about. So language policy is often directed, at least in its genesis, towards newly independent post-colonial states. In fact, to a significant degree, the field of language policy studies as an academic area, but also in terms of advising, professional advising through major corporations and international assistance from government, arose in a context of Asian and African post-colonial nation building in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the principal way in which it was conceived initially in many studies was how to assist these societies to devise an administrative and national agenda that more or less resembled the consolidated nation states of the developed world at the time, the global north. And it was led by experts or funded by aid from the global north. So this residue of these origins is still there in some of the work, although it's been heavily critiqued. In its earliest era, the field of language policy studies was characterized by a lot of optimism, the belief that through the application of technical protocols, they would solve problems relatively readily. It imagined itself as a science in the way that the public policy sciences all through the world in the 1950s and 60s, but especially in the United States, imagined themselves as a science. And we have to keep in mind that this was the Cold War, and to a period, and to a significant degree, policy science was influenced by the idea at the time of the defeat of communism and building a kind of government that was technically and scientifically run, and that would bolster populations against the temptations of the socialist world. So this was definitely part of the logic of the early days of the field. But language policy is pursued by different groups of people for different purposes. Its aims and philosophies are heterogeneous and not unitary. Some language policy, a great deal of it perhaps, is actually pursued with very repressive objectives in mind and not emancipatory ones. It's very important because in developed countries, the whole fostering of multilingualism through language policy, I think, leads people to believe that the field itself of language policy is itself emancipatory, but it's in fact capable of being used for multiple purposes. So the model I'm going to use is down there, LP, language policy. I3 I see as resulting from three forms of authorization or power, and I'll describe them briefly. The four forms of participation or involvement, and 6 goals. And I won't label the goals very much or talk about them very much, but I do want to talk about A3 and P4 for the most part. Language interests and language problems are clearly important in the character of what is adopted as a language policy in multilingual states in both the global north and the global south. But far too few research studies on language policy look at either language problems as they are understood by the people developing policies and language interests. And by interests, I mean cultural, economic, symbolic, and political interests of key groups. It's very important, if we're going to talk about policy, to not forget that we're talking about a process that's connected etymologically with politics, and therefore interests and power, which are the raw material of politics, infuse themselves into policy. In fact, in many languages that I speak and know, like, certainly in Italian and I believe also in French, there's no distinction between the word policy and the word politics. La politica in Italian means both politics and the policy. And I think this suggests a closer connection to the discourse I've been talking about, the connection with interests and problems. So the nature of interests and the character of language problems were topics of the pioneer theorists in language planning, but have been discarded to a significant degree by later theorizations, most of which have adopted a critical stance, which comes from different positions. I'll talk about that. In 1985, Hans Stuhr from the Central Institute of Indian Languages, not far from where Anik is right now, claimed in 1985 that the characterization and systematic account of language problems of a speech community is a prerequisite to an adequate theory of policy formulation, language planning, and language treatment. And in other writing by Indian scholars at the time, there was a similar attention to language problems. Over time, even Dua himself in later work, when I met him at the Central Institute of Indian Languages in Mysore some years ago, had moved on to talk about language goals. Professor Spolsky speaks of language management, Robert Cooper of social change. So people have moved away to a large extent from talking about problems for reasons that are understandable and good. But it is, I think, also a risk to do this. So the typology that Hans Stewart devised out of this was to focus on not just an acceptance that problems are a pre-existing objective reality, but to look at who defines what is taken to be a language problem. Are the people who define these problems inside these language circumstances, or are they outsiders? In other words, are they making decisions for people, or are they democratically involving people in the making of decisions about their languages and lives? Are they politicians or bureaucrats? Mostly they are, in fact. Are they researchers or professionals? Very rarely are they. Are they this concept called the people? So he asked these questions, and he developed a typology that looked at these definers of language problem against different social needs, whether they're normative, in other words, needs in which professionals or experts dominate and suggest what should be done, whether they're the felt needs that affected groups and individuals say, this is what we want done with our language. We want, I'll give you a very simple example of this. I was working in the Mon state in Myanmar once, and I'll show you some information about this a bit later. And one of the mothers at this session, who had just listened to this long session by an education official, said, "You keep telling us what this problem is. I don't feel it's like that at all." So this was a perfect example of what Dua was expressing here, the subjective experience of being inside someone else's characterization of your language situation as being a problem, and their situation of it. What is expressed, in other words, not all language problems or what could be considered language problems are ever converted into action. Only some of them are elevated into policy. And when we look at them, they tend to be the problems as perceived by elites. This is very clearly the case, that they tend to prevail in what things get given policy resources, funding, legislation, etc. So I'm going to discuss a new way of talking about problems that's come out of this work that I've done in Southeast Asia. And originally, I started thinking like this when I was working in Sri Lanka in the late 1990s. I'm very delighted that my colleague Harsha is, Dr. Wijasekara is online and has done really substantial work in this area as well. And Sri Lanka's history of language policy development is very important in world terms. So we have a history of thinking about language problems, which was an undemocratic legacy that had problematical ethics associated with it. But I still think it's important to retain a connection with how policymakers think about problems, because they dominate. So I'm going to place language policy within a political economy and socio-legal perspective. As I said, I'm drawing on both global South and global North contexts. And this framework that I'm going to present, I've been developing for some years. I'm going to make it a major objective of my own to formalize this in a specific publication, but I've published a little bit of it in different areas. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of 3A, 4P, and 6G. 3A is how political agents use sovereignty, that is the exclusive political authority, to direct state lawmaking or coercive power towards language interventions. It's very important to keep in mind that much language policy is directive, top-down, coercive power done in the space of the political jurisdiction and sovereignty of a state. Jurisdiction, which is a form of devolved sovereignty, and this is relatively autonomous in both global north and south settings. I'll talk about that. And then influence, how everyone present today, and I myself and others, can deploy agency to shape, empower, to inform, to resist changes proposed by some people and to propose others. Those three forms of authorization behind forms of language change, and language policy, of course, refers to planned language change, because language changes anyway in multiple ways that are outside the control of planning or the intentional designs of human beings that can happen through incidentally, through technology, through accidents, through any number of things. But we're talking about planned or deliberate change in this context. These three forms of authority interact with modes of participation, which public texts or official texts, discourse, performative action, and I'm going to talk about a fourth one here, the deliberative process. A special message to my friend Fethi, who's in the audience today as well. And these are directed towards 6 goals mainly, usually the status of a language, the legal status and protection of a language, and that's mostly done by powerful agents in legal settings using public texts. Corpus reform, in which linguists tend to have a strong role around questions of orthography, terminology, standardization. Learning and teaching, which Robert Cooper called acquisition planning, which involves the formal transmission of languages and literacy, whether they're small languages or large ones. Domain expansion, consolidation, and protection. They're remarkable historical examples within Catalonia for Catalan, in the Philippines with Filipino on this, but I won't talk about them today. Prestige and esteem planning, which is contesting the stigma and prejudice against minority and discriminated against languages, raising informal status. And then the work that I've done quite a bit to develop around how language planning can be seen as a form of discourse planning as well, ideological language, language in social movements. So to go through these 3 authorizations, I'll be quickly going through them. I won't read most of what's there. I'm happy to share the slides, of course. Heinz Kloss in the United States, a German scholar, went to the United States, looking at American language policy, distinguished between sovereignty and jurisdiction as 2 forms of authorization for language planning. And I think it's pretty obvious that jurisdiction refers to laws, statutes that have a binding directive as of a state. And that's just as true in China or Tuvalu or South Africa as the US, but his example was the US. And then sovereignty, and we can make this clear from a Chinese example, where you can look at the devolution of jurisdiction to Hong Kong after the Basic Law was adopted, with the handover of power from British colonial rule to China for a 50-year period of sovereignty. This particular form of control, moderation for 50 years, is one of the ways in which you can distinguish between full jurisdiction and sovereignty, and they make a difference. But the one I've introduced into this model is about influence, and I think that it works in relation to the other 2 very clearly. And we can see influence in several kinds of ways. One of them is institutional, and the second one is non-institutional. In the second paragraph, I talk about the institutional form of official influence. And we see this in the way, after 1 decade of Japan and South Korea emerging as fully successful trading economies in the 60s and 70s, they created the Japan Foundation in 72 and the Korea Foundation in 91. This is soft power, the idea of spreading the promotion of their teaching of their languages. In 1987, China created the National Office of the Teaching of Chinese as a foreign language, developed the Chinese proficiency test. These forms of projection and promotion of the language are forms of external institutional influence. The Confucius Institute is another example. Of course, there's the Goethe Institute and the Alliance Française, multiple agencies of this kind. What's more interesting, really, is at the non-institutional level, and that is how individual actors use cultural capital, develop forms of influence as citizen insiders. They're working within their communities. They use their agency to advocate language change. And this can happen legitimately within decision-making systems, or it can happen transgressively. We can see this in terms of the way Esperanto was forced to transgressively operate outside of established power systems in a capillary way over a long period of time, more than well over 100 years, to establish the position that it has today. So it's very clear, working against state power is an immense struggle to achieve change. The authorization power is either legitimate citizen advocacy or it's a subversive form of radical change. Now, you can see this in the way Twitter language policing works, in woke language, in multiple kinds of gender reforming language, anti-racist language. All these forms of language change are influence-based forms of language policy and planning making, which don't end up in an official text, but they end up changing language very directly by inserting themselves into the marketplace. And they achieve their authority via influence. And this influence can happen because the agents doing this have significant cultural capital available to them, and they're able to convert this capital in a kind of Bourdieu understood kind of way into a material advantage which other people then emulate, or they do it just in terms of mobilizing actual power in economic markets. So there are multiple ways this happens. It can happen through music, it can happen through literature in multiple kinds of ways. Just as a side interest, I do work on the way in which Dante Alighieri in 14th century Italy, as a literary scholar, but also a language planner, theorized how to influence people and build language change. So it's not a new thing. So these forms of authority and power are activated through 4 modes of participation. Sometimes I've used 3 here, but I'm going to talk about 4 today. And each of these is associated with individual actors in these containers. I'll describe more of what I mean by containers in a minute. There are the political ones in which legal officials predominate and policy officers, and they have coercive power. They're professional ones that work through persuasion, rhetoric, and argument. They're civil ones, or they're dissident actors, and we'll go through them now. These 4 modes of participation produce public texts, and public texts are laws or official documents that are produced by political actors, legal agents, public officials, or consultants. When I give you some concrete examples in a few moments from Global South environments, you'll see how all these things actually interact with each other. Public discourse, and this refers to arguments. We really need to keep in mind that actually everyone has language policy power available to them. If you participate actively in public discourse, even in repressive states and containers, it's really quite possible to change the way people talk about things. There are multiple examples of the way rhetorical intervention, the contesting rhetoric of citizen groups forces interlocutors to adjust how they talk about the same thing, especially when it's about other languages. And we see that this can produce forms of change which are slower, not necessarily guaranteed of success, can be rolled back, but nevertheless, they're part of this iteration, what we might call the agitational space of argument. Then there's performative action, and performative action means the models that are provided by powerful figures. These might be cultural celebrities, or technological innovation, different ways in which performance models language which other people then follow. And the one I'm going to talk about the most is the one that's good for academics to listen to, because it gives some credence to the power of research. And research has a very problematical relationship with decision-making and power, and I'm going to talk about that in my final few slides. So this is facilitation through expert-guided decision-making, and that's another form of participation. I'm not going to talk about this very much, but just to say that these 3 forms of authority and these 4 forms of participation are all directed towards either elevating the status of a language, which is de jure, that is, in Latin, it means the legal form of a status of a language, whether it gets into a constitution. You can see this in South Africa, which went from having the domination of English and Afrikaans to a constitution after apartheid in the mid-1990s that has 11 African languages plus English and Afrikaans. And this happened through the formal legal status being given to these languages. Whether that changes things on the ground is another question altogether. To modify the corpus of a language, to promote learning of that language, to expand domains, as I said before, to raise prestige, or to generate or naturalize discourse of some kind, gender equality, green politics, even nationalism, which works in a very banal way. People's loyalty to a particular state is inculcated in schools and in directly through, military service and lots of things, but also in multiple, innumerable banal ways through naturalizing the idea that people essentially belong to particular traditions and not to others. Radical thought, etc. All of these are goals or purposes that language policy activity achieves. So you can see these are containers. These are water containers. They have very different shapes. And water modifies itself to take the shape of the container that it's in. In its natural form, water is like this. But even here, water is extremely diverse in the shape that it takes. So I'd like you to keep in mind this idea that actually, if we imagine language policy process as water, the container within which it is actually introduced can be radically different from one setting to another. So a global north political environment and social environment in which there is a long tradition of such as in Sweden, of technical rulings on language, is a radically different socio-political container for language change in a deliberate way from a post-colonial country like, imagine Timor-Leste after its independence, bitter turmoil, great poverty, multilingualism, no institutions to speak of, and multiple agitational forms to create some kind of consensus. So really, really almost incomparable from each other. But it could also be the difference between a road sign and a secessionist language revival movement. A municipal plan, say, let's imagine a city where you are located right now, or my city of Melbourne. If we want to produce road safety information in several languages, this is the authority on which this operates is not one of sovereignty, really. It's devolved legal responsibility jurisdictionally given to a city. It's delivered programmatically. It has no romantic nationalist rhetoric about it at all, even though sometimes it can have. By contrast, imagine a language revival movement that is actually aspiring to break away from the country in which it is currently part. And this defies all the official representations. It mobilizes a discourse of historic legitimacy, of natural justice, and it does the discourse. It performs the change that it wants to produce. It performs it in rhetoric, in the way people talk about their language, their group, the other group. In other words, language is performative in language policy and planning just as much as it is anywhere else. Very little actual language planning is rational, in inverted commas. I mentioned the unideological Swedish example, although Sweden can get very ideological in its language planning on some issues sometimes. But Dahlstedt, in a really fine study in 1976, talked about this broad public acceptance from the population that if a group of linguists got together and said we should modify the language in this way, most people would just accept it. It wouldn't have been regarded as a controversial thing to do. So that's what he meant by this total societal range. So the power difference between all of these groups is really important that we keep in mind that what citizens and experts, agents can do is to influence how discourse around language is organized. And when we do that, we help to elevate some areas of concern into being a policy problem. Once they're converted into being a policy problem, it's more likely that policy officials will give it some kind of attention. Look, I won't say much about this slide. There's a lot on it, but what I really wanted to say is that some people writing very much in post-structural ways to understand language policy and planning talk about the globalization of the world as though nation states have ceased to exist. And I think this is really exaggerated a lot in the literature that we read. And I'll cite here Joseph Alpha back in 1986, and I think what he said is true today. He said there are 4 institutions that, despite the best efforts of radical revolutionaries for over a century, never seem to go away. That should be go away, not do away. And these are state, nation, language, and religion. And I think this is a useful caution against regarding the fact that there are global patterns and networks in which we all belong, in which as being the new state of things that has done away with old patterns. This is not really the case. This recent study by Klaus Kramer shows from the research that he did that in Europe there is what he called a longing for a national container, even within a Europe with its transnational structures of the European Union. So the national and the global coexist with the local always in a kind of iterative process of influencing each other, producing each other, oscillating between one and the other. And I want to give you a very precise example of this. Some years ago, I attended, this was in 2012, I attended this was in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, a meeting at which Asean, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 12 countries, or there might be 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which had always had English as its de facto language, and on this occasion adopted English, or maybe they did it later, but they adopted English officially as their language of meeting. And all of these countries, every single one of them at the time, was involved in a process of denial of their minority populations of subnational language rights. Meeting in an open park, not far, but also not far from the plush hotels of the Asean meeting, was a group of what's called the Indigenous Peoples and Ethnic Minorities of Asean, IP and EM. And this is the statement they issued. We, the Indigenous Peoples, Ethnic Minorities, comprise more than 100 million, representing distinct identities and diverse cultures of the ASEAN. We are referred to in different names: ethnic minorities, hill tribes, indigenous communities, orang asli, orang asal, ethnic groups, ethnic nationalities, masyarakat adat, among others. We are facing common historical injustices, marginalization, exclusion, etc. We assert our distinctive identities, self-governance, traditional livelihood, etc. Look at the rhetoric of this. It's the kind of language, the rhetorical, assertive, powerful, incredibly articulate language in English of advocacy. This is language policy shaping language within one of the 4 Ps that I mentioned before, the public discourse P, aiming to influence the sovereign states. So this ASEAN is a transnational container, and it has radically different named problems. It names as the main problem the fact that the countries, as you can see at the top, want more English. They want free capital movement. They want to be like the European Union and eliminate tariffs. They want to integrate. And as they do this, English becomes stronger. And beneath them, 100 million people representing these distinct identities doing the complete opposite, demanding multilingual rights, demanding justice, demanding these sub-national policy changes, when at the supranational, transnational container level, it's all a move towards English monolingualism. Now, it's no surprise, as you can see at the bottom in the quote, that in many of these states, there are conflicts surrounding language, 26, some of them very, very significant and violent, because, as the authors that I quote there say, quite often the assaults on people's identities are driven by language policies, and you can see exactly how in that discussion. So, how am I going to recuperate the idea of a language problem when I have said that language problems are often defined by dominant groups in their own interests and they impose these on other people? Well, I think we have to accept that policymakers think of problems as the precursor to a policy. The reason you have a policy in any area, you need a road from X to Y, and it's a problem because people can't get from X to Y. You need to build a road. That's a banal example. And it would be relatively uncontroversial in most cases. But in language policy problems, what happens is that the problem is a problem of the interests of the people defining the problems, because any society can have multiple language policies and yet they have one or two only, or they have a policy that promotes only the national language and English in their schools, and they might tolerate multilingualism or something like that. So what we've tried to do, and what I've devised through what I call deliberation conferencing or facilitated dialogue, sometimes supported by a research method that I won't be able to talk about today, called Q sorting, we work through the naming of problems democratically from the bottom up. So what we tend to do is to go away, as you can see at the very bottom, we're locked away for 3 to 6 days of intensive facilitated work. I've done 45 of these facilitated dialogues in Myanmar between 2011 and 2019, 10 in both Eastern and Peninsular Malaysia, and 7 in Thailand. 40 to 60 participants, community organizations and civil society, public officials, academic experts, and think tanks. And keep those in mind, because I'm going to talk about how these people talk later. So the community meaning basically citizens inside the language problem, thinking of Hans Duer's categories before, public officials and politicians outside the problem, imposing solutions on people, not always, sometimes, and academic experts. And we need to see ourselves as others see us in these environments, as I'm going to describe in a few minutes. Now, facilitation and dialogue is actually widely used within multiple international environments as a problem-solving practice. I don't use standard facilitation. I use a form of facilitation influenced by the work of Gregory Bateson, the American anthropologist, which he really calls a metalogue or a multi-log, in which we start from first principles. We start from who we are and what we're talking about, what the problems we name are. We try to get everyone to say something so that no one can be denied the right to speak. I mean, that's a standard practice in facilitation and dialogue. But these are heavily influenced, the way I do them, with the thinking of Gregory Bateson. I can't describe it, but just enough to understand it here. In Myanmar, this was part of a wider process of developing a language policy, which took multiple directions and produced an agreed language policy draft. Unfortunately, everyone knows what's happened in Myanmar in the last year, and all of these things have come to a halt. But nevertheless, through this process, we managed to influence the national education law, the national broadcasting and communications law, and other laws through the process of bottom-up dialogue. And these are some of the ways in which it is done, basically starting with the ground-up concept of what is the problem, who is going to name the problem, what is the policy that we're going to write for this problem. And I'm going to describe just in a minute the kind of, sorry, if you are interested in the references, I meant to leave this as the last slide. These are some of them that you can consult. But basically, we work through a process of multiple democracies, I call it, in which we make very slow decisions because we want the decisions to be persuasive. I distinguish these in two ways. On the one hand, voice democracy and vote democracy. By voice democracy, I mean an iterative process of public persuasion, interpersonal persuasion, rhetoric, facts, new perspectives. We, the people that I showed you before, we talk for hours and hours and hours. We put on the wall the evolving understanding of what to do with the language problems. Everyone annotates them in their own way, in their own language. We collect them together at night, translate them into English and the other languages we're working with, print them off, and then work through them the next day. So it's a constant collective writing of voice democracy in which the three groups of people, officials, the community, and academic experts, combine their perspectives together. The advantage of slow processes like this is that consensus can be reached, that people learn more about each other, that it's possible for people's views to be modified. This happens very often. It's not rare, but it's inefficient in the short term. In the long term, it's much more efficient because people have come to understand each other better and their perspectives, and we can agree to disagree and still work together. Sometimes we adopt research projects to explore problems more carefully together. In vote democracy, we decide with hands or a secret ballot. There's a minority decision. It's efficient in the short term, problematic in the long term, and people must accept the result if they lose. So, you know, one of the things that we talk about in these facilitated dialogues is how we are, who we are, and what we do is we constitute ourselves as a mini nation, a mini container, deciding through voice and vote democracy the processes of decision making. And the voices of the people are categorized in these kinds of ways. The three interest groups: the experts, the researchers, the officials, and the community. And I divide them into information, ideology, and interests. The experts produce knowledge through investigation. All of us, all of you in the audience, this is mostly how we imagine ourselves. It's how we imagine knowledge existing. It's what we understand the process of producing knowledge to be. It's published mostly in academic journals and books, and disseminated through the networks that those allow for. We tend to use technical language, as I have done today, and as all of us do, unfortunately sometimes impenetrably so, and statistics. The time frame that we use for most of the work that we do is set by funding requirements or by discovery, if we're lucky enough to have research assignments in which we can just pursue a problem until we discover what we're seeking to find. And the most important, I think, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn for you as academic researchers, but I think the most important thing that motivates researchers is to explain phenomena, especially human and social phenomena. And so this is what I think is our framework of approach as academic researchers. But officials in all of these dialogues that I've talked about, nearly 55 or 6 of them, are radically different in the way they see knowledge, information, and ideology. They tend to see knowledge as this, as something that's produced through practical action. They actually know a lot, and a lot of academics sometimes, not a lot, some academics sometimes, unfortunately discount the knowledge that comes through the practical action that policymakers and officials have. And they tend to talk about problems as the core activity of language policy making, of any policy making. And so if we shun the terminology, we create a greater distance between us and them. They tend to write what they do into laws, regulations, ministerial briefs, and speeches. And you know, the rhetoric and discourse of these forms of writing is completely different from what academic journals and articles do, which obviously have to evidence things and have to provide justification and multiple forms of reasoning, and we have to elaborate, etc. Whereas these things are often very brief and sharp and to the point. They tend not to use technical language, but they use 2 forms of language, what I'm going to call bureaucratic language, which is the language of protecting yourself from consequences, and public language, the language of appealing to the citizens, which is both of which are quite different from the technical language of academic discourses. The time frame is not set by funding or discovery, but by rapid things. The minister wants something done yesterday, and so the public official just responds to it. So many people I've worked with who are academic researchers constantly get into trouble when they work with policymakers and officials, because the culture of research knowledge and the culture of knowledge in officialdom is so different. But we should at least acknowledge that it is another form of knowledge. And what's more important than explanation of a phenomenon is efficiency, the efficiency of getting things done. By contrast with all of this, the community perspectives are worked through knowledge produced through experience, familial experience. In all of the dialogues I did, families, but even teachers often, and local language and culture associations, local poetry writing groups trying to develop a language that's been shunned from the education system, and they want to keep the cultural production going in it. All of these is through an experiential involvement with knowledge that's produced, knowing people, networks of authority and value. And these are discussed and circulated in networks of trust. They're not published in academic journals. They're not written into regulations. If a particular individual who's regarded as the language person in some Indigenous communities that I've worked with, the expert culture person in that community, the rhetorical expert in that, the orator chief in a particular, these are trusted individuals who have their authority on the basis of other people attributing to them this role. When they describe their experience in these dialogues, it's often very felt, as I described before, of the Morn woman, and it uses ordinary language, and very often this is looked down on both by officials and experts, unfortunately. The time frame in all of the dialogues of the community is a time frame set by the needs of children, by personal experiences with young people, my grandchildren. People often say things like that, my grandchildren, my niece, and they frame their position, and they're often positioned out of defining what is going to go into a language problems because of the way they speak. And in these dialogues, we try to do the opposite and include this perspective very directly in constant rewriting of how we are defining what needs to be done. So it's either family responsibilities, culture, or religion. And the most important aspect, more important than efficiency, more important than explanation, is the existential aspect of living with a language and culture identity. Now, I'm just going to finish in a few moments and say that in the global north and the global south, there are some quite radical differences in language policy formulation. And I've been thinking about these since Anik asked me to take this perspective. And one of the main ones, I think, is to go right back to the 3 forms of authorization and the 4 forms of participation I mentioned at the beginning. How is language policy authorized and who participates in it? And when you look at global south and global north countries, and I've worked in lots of both, what we find is that in poor developing global south countries, in low income post-colonial countries, there is a significant penetration of outsider influence on domestic policy, which is very rare in global north advanced societies. Norway or Germany do not include large numbers of UN consultants in shaping what they do for the teaching of English or Latin in their schools. This, however, is very common in developing countries around questions of literacy, around questions of language policy. This is changing today because intense globalization, economic markets mean, as the quote there from Lingard, Rowell and Taylor says, there's a kind of diaspora of policy ideas, a cosmopolitan habitus of policymakers. Policymakers write and read the same journals, they influence each other, their ideas flow rapidly and they compare their work. But that's still not the same as what goes on in global south countries. Here in global south countries, multinational donor agencies, even though they operate through, they tend to operate through internationally sourced advisors. I've been in this role myself multiple times. It's a very challenging role. It's an ethically very challenging role, and technically as well. They work through project-based funding of local activities often, but they still have immense power over the top of local officials, local communities, and local academic experts. And this is highly problematical. And they get involved in curriculum trials, evaluations, textbook production. Now, many of these people, of course, are highly principled and extremely dedicated and hardworking, but nevertheless, the structural inequalities are there. And foreign models of education are often visible in the assumptions, concepts, and forms of working that such advisors bring in and the projects that are generated from international funding. I've seen and critiqued probably 40 of these. The relationships and forms of policy that result are often, we can describe them as policy borrowing or policy transfer, but I think there's much more involved, and some of what's involved is very problematical and challenging in language policy terms. They might be applicable in global north settings, this concept of borrowing and transfer, but these countries tend to be sheltered. You know, they're protected from external influence. They can allow in as much as they want and keep it out when they don't wish it. But in global south countries, the control of domestic cultural consequences and local political repercussions from external influence is much harder. This is sometimes because local interests ally themselves with external interests in very complicated projects of influence. And so it's not just a one-directional way. There are multiple ways in which local communities, local power holders in local communities work against other local interests. But what tends to happen is this greater penetration of external bodies into local decision-making can be highly problematical, because what it tends to do is to lower and infringe on the policy sovereignty of local states and create forms of dependency on outside influences. I've always been very, very conscious of this. I've written about it and critiqued it, and that's why I've adopted this methodology of the facilitated dialogue, where the actual writing of the solutions to the problems that we name is done by local individuals with the help of a facilitator. Because we know that literacy in spoken languages of children is well established as foundational for successful education of students, this particular problem of external excessive influence in language policy becomes really key in this particular area. And in literacy, it's immensely problematical today because literacy is often removed from any kind of critique. It's just assumed to be a unilateral good. And of course, literacy is good, but literacy is socially differentiated in the way it's distributed. There are forms of literacy that are denied to some people and that other people gain. Forms of teaching of literacy in schools tend to result in only minimal literacy for minority populations and multilingual, Indigenous and refugee and rural populations, and cultural and elite expanded forms of literacy for elites. And so literacy, I think, should be critiqued in exactly the same way in which we critique other projects of the United Nations and other bilateral and multilateral donors in terms of its distribution, the fairness and equity of access to it, the kinds of literacies that are available to groups of people and how these are. And the agencies that are involved all come with their own agendas, and they make local partnership arrangements with people who share them. And so the space is extremely dynamic and very different from what you find in global North settings. I think I would identify this as the biggest single difference in language policy formulation between the two. I'm going to finish in just 1 minute, and I'm going to say that language policy needs to be, as a practice, but also as a theoretical construct, more grounded and realistic. I believe it's really important to be realistic and grounded. And this partly means recuperating the idea of problems, because that's how people understand them in policy-making circles. And as academic practitioners in language planning and policy, we want to influence in the best possible way what goes on through the research that we do. So for decades, I want to conclude by thinking about deliberation here. For decades, even outside of formal democratic societies, there's been an aspiration to understand the public space, what brings Malaysians together as Malaysians in the public sphere, or Maltese. You know, when we imagine the national container of our national space, we like to imagine it as a communicative order. That is a place of speech in which people talk to each other. If you think of the metaphors that people use to describe what it means to be a citizen, a lot of them are about speech and talk. So as a result of this, some form of deliberation, which means talk and weighing up of alternatives, has become an aspiration of citizen life and politics. It means our sense of how public life should be conducted. The European Union, for example, regularly talks of itself. Whether it does this in reality is another question, of course, but regularly speaks of itself as a communicating place. So we imagine how we belong together as being a kind of conversation that we're engaged in with fellow citizens. And Margaret Cohn, in some work on this, said that this is the normative basis of democratic theory today. And the main objective of this is that rational consensus can be engendered through discussion. I think a lot of people believe this. I think a lot of academics believe this. I have often believed this. I'm more skeptical than I used to be, because when you look at how rhetoric operates in reality, rational consensus engendered through discussion is a very difficult thing to achieve. But a purely discursive vision of politics, that is seeing our public space as a zone of discourse, a container of conversation. This vision of politics, unfortunately, needs to take account of inequities in language as well as in everything else, of hierarchies, of speech power, of control, of discourse, and so on. And so we need to be realistic about the limits of dialogue and the role of entrenched interests, power, and ideologies. And yet, I think the facilitated dialogues that I've been involved in and others that many people have done does make a difference. I think we've got concrete evidence that this is the case. So we need to interact between this form of deliberation and other forms of influence through the exercise of power. When we talk of language problems, I don't think it's technicism. The radical critics of language planning during the 1990s, language policy and planning, described language policy theory as technical and technicistic and this kind of repudiation. And I think that this is part of an excessively critical tendency that we had in the 1990s and maybe more, maybe again today. It's important to be critical. Scholars are critical. Criticism and critique are part of being academic life. But language policy and planning is something that engages with the real world of language problems and opportunities for people. So it's not enough to be critical. We must also be practical. We can't move too far from ordinary citizens. We can't move too far from the containers in which they live and work, nations, education systems, and workplaces. This is where they need to agitate for change and use language in those containers to bring about change in what's afforded by the systems that they're part of. In these conventional spaces, any policy is seen as a problem-solving activity, and language policy is approached this way too. So if we don't do it as language policy experts, we create a gap and a gulf and create barriers between us and the people whose work we want to interact with and influence. So I'm just going to conclude here. For language policy studies to retain credibility and to be understood by policymakers, officials, and government agents, I think we need to recover some more groundedness and realism. And I think that's part of the work of advancing linguistic justice. Thank you very much.